I am going to be short and sweet so that David can do all the talking, because we know he likes to do that. So David is obviously the CEO of RZSS currently. He has been in the zoo business, I think, more years than he would care to admit, but had an amazing career throughout it, worked in lots of different shapes and forms throughout it. So I'm going to hand over to him to tell you all about everything that he's learned along the way, and where he sees the future going as well. David, before you start your talk, you have to tell us about your mug.
Thank you, Becky. I'm afraid it's a company about low loaders and metal processors. It's really not that exciting, but I could talk for ages on coffee. I'm happy to do that. I might get more participants. I might get more, up to 70 odd on participants rather than the 55 that there is now. Not that I'm feeling under pressure. Anyway, guys, it's incredibly exciting, and I it's not a cliche, but I am quite honoured to be asked to talk to you guys. I did many years ago talk to the BIAZA Education Conference, and they've always been fantastic. So thank you. But I guess when you're asked to do a talk about, which is effectively about a retrospective of your own career, it usually means you're either facing retirement or being around a fair bit. I kind of hope it's the latter. And yeah, I have worked in a fair number of different zoos, from small private zoos, which no longer exist, Penn-Skinner Wildlife Park, to charity zoos, big and small. I've been part of BIAZA, IAZA, and WAZA. So, you know, it kind of does give me a bit of an insight and perhaps a view, some might say biased, as to how zoos have changed or are changing over the last 25 years or so. There is a very well-known diagram about the evolution of zoos, which I expect all of you have seen. It was done by George Rabb of the Brookfield Zoo, which kind of shows the progression, or rather the linear development of zoos over time, from menageries through to entertainment centres, to conservation centres and eco parks. You know, it's a great way of sort of charting our history in a rather superficial way, but it's about more, I think, more like how we presented ourselves over time. What I think is more significant, and what I want to touch on today, is not so much how our appearance or our branding might have changed, but rather how what we achieve has changed. Have our values, perspectives, and more especially our impact changed over time? So let's start with sort of animal welfare and ethics. And look, I know these are two separate disciplines, but I am just going to conflate them for the purposes of this talk. Undoubtedly, there has been considerable advances in the way we care for animals. Science-based husbandry guidelines, tags, ZIMs, the increasing use of big data to inform our work. Just look at zoo vets. 25 years ago, there was probably only a dedicated zoo vet at London Zoo, certainly in the UK. And that's why the International Zoo Vet Group was started. And more and more now we are seeing zoos having their own vet, and that has to be the way to go forward. Now, of course, we would expect this advancement in knowledge and practice within our community, as we see across so many different parts of and spheres of society. It is a bit dispiriting and depressing that the variation in practice and implementation of that knowledge is so different across so many zoos across UK and Europe. But to be honest, that's a talk for another day. But what about the value about caring for animals? For most of our keeping and animal care staff, I genuinely don't think this has changed. Regardless of the circumstances they found themselves in, they've always put their charges first. They've always gone above and beyond to look after their animals. Now, look, we know that husbandry has changed. We know that individual circumstances might not have been the case. But in general, the individuals in our care staff have always had that value for caring for animals. Where I think the change has come has been institutionally, has been amongst management, has been amongst owners of zoos. They become more ethical, more mission focused, more professional. But has that change been driven by legislation? Has it been driven by peer pressure? Has it been driven by external factors in society? And I think the main question that I would put to this group is, have zoos led or have they followed? Did we change because Born Free was created? Discuss, well, not discuss yet. My other concern is that, we are not the ones that are leading these changes. Are we the catalysts for the big changes? Now, to be clear, I'm talking about the wider community. There are some zoos amongst our communities who truly are, leading the way, are showing the way. But are these the outliers and not the norm? Where does this leave us today, especially when we consider our kind of growing experiences market? Back in my day, and forgive me for that phrase, I was involved with elephant shows, yeah, not demonstrations, shows. I even got involved with camel rides at different points. Now, I'm not seeking to kind of defend what we've done with the past, although I heard a strange defense of chimpanzees tea parties not so long ago. But I think it's very important that we don't necessarily attack the past. We learn from it and critique it, but not necessarily attack it. But when it comes to the experiences that we are doing in our zoos today, which I think are incredible, how long will it be before giraffe feeding by the public or keeper experience days, keeper for the day events are deemed unethical, or even our lemur walkthroughs, for instance, have to be closed because we're potentially exposing them to unknown viruses that might emerge from different parts of the world? We've got to be ahead of the game and discussing these questions, really looking at these activities, researching them both from the welfare aspects and the benefit aspects. Because there are, I do believe, real benefits towards our connectedness strategies, our learning strategies, and there are commercial benefits. I can't deny that, but we really must look at these and answer them. Otherwise, other bodies, other organizations will be setting the agenda. For me, how I've seen these experiences grow have been incredible. And I think we should do as much as we can to maintain these experiences and even go further so we can create the most incredible emotional experience for our visitors, because we urgently do need to turn more people onto wildlife, to love and want to care for animals. And we do that first by emotion and then by learning. We are the very best people to create these experiences, which ensures the welfare of animals throughout their lives. Because if we don't do it, others will, because the general public have the need for this animal contact. And other less professional organizations will step in if we walk away. And I think the other important aspect is that people do need these close connections with animals. We might think that putting our animals in a big immersive environment and making it look like the wilds of Asia, etc., is the way to connect. You know what? That just ain't going to cut the mustard. We've got to bring people and animals close together, and we are the most professional organizations to be able to do that. Moving on to conservation. It's right and proper that we celebrate that the level of conservation that zoos are now doing has increased. But let's put it out there from the very start. It's nowhere near enough. Now, some zoos like Washington, the Smithsonian Institute, Durrell, London Zoo, have been doing active conservation work for many years. There are species out there, such as the lion tamarins, that exist today only because of the incredible work that individuals in those institutions have done. I often hear people saying, oh, but we're just not big enough to do the level of conservation that London Zoo does. Well, do you know what? Across our members, we've got places like Sholden Zoo and the Hawk Conservancy that are absolute leaders in the community and what they achieve for the relative size of their organization. Can we honestly say to ourselves that we are achieving as much conservation as we should be doing and need to be doing? Earlier in my career, zoos were getting themselves organized into proper scientifically led breeding programs. BIAZA actually had some of the first with the joint management of species programs for anthropoid apes. BIAZA was just getting going, and of course has now developed into some of the most extraordinary alliance of responsible zoos and well structured in these breeding programs, amongst many things. But I think the change that we've seen over recent years is the realization that these breeding programs, these EEPs, are not conservation in themselves. They're important for maintaining healthy and sustainable populations in zoos, but they are not conservation. And far too regularly, we see amongst our members us going out there and celebrating the fact that we've bred an endangered animal as part of the European conservation breeding programs, blah, blah, blah. You know what? Let's get honest and transparent about what we are doing. There are some of these EEPs that really do have conservation focus, but most of them are about maintaining animals in our zoos. And that's fine. That's good. That's responsible business operations. But we can only claim conservation breeding in our zoos when the animals are part of wider conservation breeding programs or wider conservation action plans. And there are many, many species, such as pond mud snails, such as pine hoverflies, and I'm using examples from our institution where there is no EEP, but there is a fundamental reintroduction program going on. Let's make sure we are honest and transparent in our conservation activities, because we do some incredible stuff that nobody else can do. The IUCN is now recognizing our formal role, zoos' formal role in conservation. The translation of our husbandry and our care techniques and our educational techniques to the wild and to the communities around where animal lives are fundamentally important. And the field scientists are looking for our expertise. Our conservation veterinary medicine techniques are becoming increasingly important in the wild. We have incredible and vitally important contributions to make to field conservation. Let's celebrate and do more of what counts. One of the things that people often say to me is about, oh, we give lots of money to charities and conservation in the wild. I debated about bringing this up, but I'm going to bring it up because it's good fun. You know, and one of the changes that I've seen certainly over the last 10, 15 years is more and more zoos putting money into charities in the wild and claiming that for their conservation activities. Now, look, conservation financing is important. We do it here. And as zoos, globally, we commit a huge amount of money to conservation in the wild. But when you compare that to the operational costs of zoos, it's a drop in the ocean. And when you consider it against the huge levels of cost against exhibitory of animals and what some animal exhibits, it's slightly embarrassing. Conservation financing is fine, but it's not an excuse for not doing conservation yourselves, active conservation. You cannot offset your conservation responsibilities. Moving on to education. Yeah, I know I'm really out of my comfort zone. But I guess the changes that I've seen over education have been threefold: what we do, what we are, and what we deliver. What we do, you know, I think I've lost count of how many zoo schools, education classes, biology worksheets that I've seen over the many years. Thankfully, you guys have come up with some of the most incredibly creative and remarkable ways to deal with the curriculum. And I know just how bounded you are by the curriculum. And we have to follow through on that kind of formal schools education. But what has been glorious is how you have broadened horizons. You have realized the importance of that informal education, so that our education departments are not just about schools. They are about every visitor that comes through our gates, and now beyond that. What we see around informal education, the interpretation is amazing, and I congratulate every one of you. It's wonderful, and it's great to see that as we go forward. But there's always a but. You know, COVID. I was going to try and get through this without mentioning it, but we're going to mention it. You know, what you all did in terms of COVID and seeking to put so much of your material online and attracting new audiences, getting it out there, much of it free, some of it paid for, whatever, doesn't matter. But you know, it was a remarkable. But why was it that COVID catalyzed that opportunity? Because it was always there. So I think it just comes back to what I said before. We've really got to be thinking broader. We've got to be having bigger ideas and not let external factors, whether it be a pandemic or an anti-zoo organization, driving what we do. Start horizon scanning, look out there, see what the opportunities are and take them, because you guys have the creativity and the brilliance to actually take advantage of them. What we are, the phrase always comes back to me is bums on seats. You know, and I guess many of you at the moment may well be going through your budgeting time. And how many of you are being asked, how much income are you bringing in? Don't you dare nod, Becky. You know, and you know, we still do it, but how much do we still think that education departments have to be income generating departments? You know, fundamentally, that's wrong. We've got to see education departments as much mission as conservation and our research departments that's there. Now, this is interesting. This is something that I'm hopefully is going full circle, because previously, when zoos first started to open their education department, it was, you know, it was about laudable aims. It was about mission. It was about teaching the children, but it wasn't about how much money they could make. Then we saw a whole bunch of zoos taking this as seeing education as income generation. We have to move away from that and assess our departments around the impact in terms of learning and behavior change. And then I guess the third aspect of what we deliver also kind of relates to bums on seats, because instead of how many people we bring through the gate, thankfully we're now starting to think about what impact, what change we're making, what quality are we delivering. Now, years ago when I was at London, we used to have a grant from the Greater London Authority, which about £500,000 that funded school children into London Zoo. That was on the basis of, you know, how many people could we get through into the zoo, particularly how many people that were on free school lunches could we get into the zoo. The real focus was numbers, not the quality of what we were delivering. So even if they were coming in for a day and didn't take an education session, it was still counted towards that grant. And that was the real focus. Now, glorious Boris Johnson, when he became Mayor of London, dragged us into his office. He guffawed and harumphed about how wonderful zoos were and how much education is valued, then told us he was cutting the grant. But of course, he'd get business to replace it, no problem at all, just one of the many lies. But being relieved of that GLA grant actually gave the organization the opportunity and the chance to go forward and get to a much more diverse range of audience, to start focusing on impact and learning instead of numbers. And you know what? Actually, the income did increase, but I think the quality and what that department was achieving multiplied rapidly because we were released from the restrictions of income. Now, whilst we're on the subject of what we deliver, you know, there is a real need to prove what we do. We regularly talk about how inspiring zoos are and how they might create the next Edinburgh, etc., and make grand claims. Intuitively, we might believe that, but we must start doing the science to show it and prove it. Now, I think Simon yesterday mentioned something about just because you see a panda, you know, we might think that turns people onto conservation. Of course it doesn't. You know, that's no one believes that. But let's not diss it completely. Perhaps that just might start the journey. But you know what? Go out and prove it one way or the other. Because unless we can prove what we do and the value of education and learning and the impact that can have on our lives, on people's lives, then the role for zoos is hugely undermined. Go out and prove what you do. So I think I'm all right with time for the moment. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about what else I think has seen more generally changed in zoos. So I touched on it earlier on, but you know, professionalism and business operations in zoos. we have seen a dramatic improvement, thank God. You know, zoos used to think themselves as some unique organization. We're not. We have to be efficient, modern, professional businesses. And we're starting to do that. And I think one of the biggest changes in there is realizing that to make a good and professional and responsible and achieving zoos, we have to acknowledge the contribution of everybody in the zoo. I'm a zookeeper. I love zookeepers. Not sure they love me, but I really believe in what zookeepers do and how important they are. We can't have a zoo without zookeepers, but we can't have a great zoo without the marketeers, the educationists, the catering assistants, and everybody. And we have to value each other equally within our zoos. Vitally, vitally important. What about those in charge of zoos? Well, I think that's interesting because, when I was starting my career, it was always, you saw the animal man, and I say animal man as the leader for the zoos. At the time it was only Molly Badham and Natalie. Oh gosh, I've forgotten the name. Oh, terrible. Molly and Nat. That's always remember them as the only sort of female leaders in zoos. Thankfully, we are seeing some improvement in diversity in leadership within our zoos, but there's huge amount. It's full of white, male, pale and stale people. But also it's interesting where it's gone from animal people to more business people. And actually, I think it's going back a little bit. And we've seen a lot of changes in recent months due to COVID changes. And I'll be interested to see, to watch what the people who come in to lead our zoos are like. Now, I might be slightly biased, and I feel I come from an animal background, but I also come from a business background. I went out and did MBAs. I did other things that gave me a balance of skills. But I do feel that unless you have somebody with conservation or animal or zoology or something at the head of the organization, does it lack authenticity when you're talking to funders and governments, etc.? I don't know. I'd be really interested to hear what people think around that. The other thing I just wanted to say is I think visitor attractions. We've often, and how our attitude to us being visitor attractions is concerned. I think we were quite ashamed about being visitor attractions or commercial institutions in the past. I'm seeing that change slightly because we really need to value ourselves as a visitor attraction. We've got to be good visitor attractions. We've got to be excellent visitor attractions. Not only are they our business model, but if you start to think of sort of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, unless we can solve that bottom of the pyramid, which is around good toilets, good coffee, good experience, you're never going to get to the top of that pyramid of people wanting to hear our message and needing to hear our message. And I think also during this period after the pandemic, or towards the end of the pandemic, we're seeing the social value of our institutions as visitor attractions, places where families can come and have solid family time, bonding time, social time. And I think that's a huge element that we need to think about going forward. And if there's any more change coming around the corner, it's our role as a social and a community resource. We are valued and valuable institutions in our community. We have an incredible role to be able to help with individual well-being and helping to strengthen the communities where we work. There are some great work going on there at the moment. Hanwell Zoo have been doing this for years and brilliant stuff. Zoological Society of East Anglia have taken the community initiative really wonderfully forward under Claire Ingram when she was there. And this is something that we absolutely really need to start thinking about as a role for ourselves. Well, look, I've got 3 very quick conclusions, if I may. Firstly, we need to value our history. You'll often hear people of my age talking about the good old days. You'll be there one day, and we shouldn't dismiss it. There are people who in our community, like Heine Hediger, Bill Conway, who just recently died, were true pioneers in our community. And although it's not essential that we learn from them and read their work to inform what we do, but it'd be hugely beneficial. And they were pioneers. You must read How to Exhibit a Bullfrog. That's if you own nothing else from this talk, please go read How to Exhibit a Bullfrog. I said it before, we need to critique the past, understand it in context and learn from it. Remember, we are the guardians of the past as much as the architects of the future. The second point I just want to make is we've got to be prepared. Not that we join the Scouts or whatever in that respect, but we've got to be prepared. Too often we're being led by others and not setting the agenda ourselves. We've got to do the big thinking. We really have. We've got to find time for reflection and big thinking and set the agenda ourselves. And thirdly, impact, what we achieve. We've got to think about, what's not going to happen if your institution doesn't exist? What change are you going to make? If we can be led by our impact ambitions, it's the biggest change we can make for our zoos. And I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. I think, a little round of applause from everyone, I think. You just said about reflecting then, and I think you've given us all plenty to reflect on within that talk. We do have one question. If anyone else has anything, then please either unmute yourself and shout out. We've got one in the chat. So from Hamish, sometimes it seems that the high desire for zoo jobs makes it easy for some zoos to not value employees. How can we improve this?
I'm not sure I quite get the question. Hamish, do you mean?
Hamish, do you want to jump in?
I guess we've all seen that zoo jobs often hundreds, maybe thousands of people will apply for a basic zookeeper job. Zookeepers are in some ways very, very replaceable. And that means for some institutions, there isn't really an incentive to pay people better, treat them better, value them more. You did talk about sort of the importance of our employees. I wonder if you've got any thoughts about how we can, I guess, make the industry as a whole a bit better for staff.
This is not an excuse, but it's a damn sight better than it was, and I think that does become an issue. For places like our BIAZA and EAZA to start sharing good practice. And it also requires institutions that might be seen to be more better. I'm not suggesting us, or I'm not suggesting the big zoos, but there's many smaller places out there that are doing good things. We need to exemplify, we need to shout from the rooftops a little bit more. To be honest, I think where we are at the moment, we're not going to get into big industry-wide initiatives. It's always going to be institutions. But I think the more that we can share best practice, be open and transparent about best practice, it will help to move the industry forward.
That's great, thank you. And Heather, I see your hand up. Do you want to unmute and jump in?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much. That was really interesting. I got a lot out of that. My question is just really on your point of conservation responsibilities in zoos. And I wondered if you had any advice. I work in a small zoo that's owned by a local authority, and their sole purpose is profit. So conservation projects are really a big obstacle. Like for instance, we were part of a harvest mouse, releasing them back into the wild project, and the loops and the jumps that we had to go through to make that work, because the people who are running the zoo effectively have no zoo experience. They just heard the word mouse and thought, what are you talking about? That's rubbish, that project. And I just wondered if you had any advice on how zookeepers can push forward with conservation projects when they're up against people that don't really have an interest in them.
So I think that's fantastic, and fantastic question. The conservation standards under our zoo licensing are about to change. To be honest, I wish they were even better. I think they were pushing us even further, but that will help you because in order for the local authority to issue a license, then quite frankly, they're going to be obliged to have to do more. But what is more, and I think if you can start looking at some of the requirements amongst your local authority, is it Lewisham? I can't quite remember which is your local authority. Then they will have a level of biodiversity commitments that they've got to do. How about you starting to be the people that deliver on that? If you can start to deliver on some of the things that they need to do, then actually they're going to be pushing resources towards you. So it may not be exactly what you want to do, but you look to see what your authorities do. We do that with Scottish Government, for instance. We were able to get money from the Zoo Fund because we were undertaking aspects of Scottish biodiversity policy, which the government wanted to continue. So they gave us money towards it and resources towards it to keep us going through COVID. And I'm thinking with Hanwell, that might be a really way forward. But also bring us down there. Use your peers, use people to come down there and challenge.
Thank you.
Thank you. I know that we're kind of at time. David, are you okay for another 5 minutes? Just because we've got some really good questions. So we've got a question from Rosie, who has asked, how can we encourage our leadership to value impact over income? So I guess that's kind of from the delivery side up. How are you influencing that way up?
So for charity zoos, then impact is going to be fundamental to how you operate. The charity code of conduct, not the charity code of conduct, but the sort of charity impact and the SORP reporting, that is going to force you down the impact way. If you're going for grants, people are going to be asking not what you do, but what you're going to achieve. And I think if you constantly actually talk that way, and I've done that, to be honest, with my board, who were often much more interested in about the different things that Becky was doing, say, in the education department, rather than the outcome or the impact at the end. As I've constantly nudged, and I love nudge, go look at nudge, talk to the board always about, we're doing this activity because it will achieve this. Then you can start to influence the knowledge or the commentary, the narrative within your organization. So if you're always talking around what you're aiming, what your activity is going to achieve, that will help to get it embedded within the organization. But I would be surprised if not most management of zoos are starting to look to that, because even if you're trying to get new grants, they'll be asking about what impact you're trying to achieve.
Great, thank you. And then kind of linked to that, thoughts on how we amplify and showcase our value. And I think this is specifically linked to funding and the amount of funding that was maybe cut during the pandemic. So how do you amplify and showcase the value specifically towards funding?
Shout from the rooftops. My God, the stuff that you do and achieve is worth shouting about. Talk, embed yourselves in the local communities, go out and talk to as many people as you can to demonstrate your value. Don't think that it's going to come just from a press release, but I'll go to the opening of an envelope. I'll go and talk to any group, anytime, at any place. And you never know where that influence will come. You are part of your communities. You are not separate from them. You need to be embedded. And the more you go out and talk to them, tell them what you're doing and telling them why you're doing it, because you want to achieve that, that is going to just build constantly your capital of value, your social license to operate, your reason for being. And then once you're going for funding and you get those community support behind it, that is all, it's all part of the jigsaw. But build your value in your communities wherever you work.
Awesome, thank you. There's one other question in the chat. Would you mind going on and answering it within the chat there, please, David?
Oh God, all right. How do I do that? All right, which one am I looking at?
It's from Bethan. So it's the one about pleasing the public who are against keeping animals in the zoo.
Oh, I can do this in 2 minutes. Okay. Stop being defensive of what you do. It's a very, very vocal minority. Use your members, use your supporters, use your community to celebrate what you do. Get out there and be in front of it. And, you know, and prove what you do, because that will keep others quiet. You might get, you know, Born Free or Chris Packham shouting about on a radio about it, you know, and I'm on the radio with them. The next minute, we're talking about what conservation projects we're working on together. So we haven't got to be defensive anymore. Go out there and shout about what you do in the communities where you work. That will keep everybody else quiet.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate. You've got some lovely comments in the chat, so have a little scroll through.
Oh, very
some
good.
People have said some nice things and everything.